My name is Dana Kelly, and I'm the Executive Director at NAGC. And today I wanted to show you how I was able to use DNA results to break through that proverbial brick wall to find two previously unknown ancestors for myself. And I think that's usually the goal that most genealogists have when they try a new tool. They are looking to grow their family tree. So I wanted to show you how I was able to do that. I manage several DNA tests through a variety of testing services. Every day, someone I've tested gets a new DNA match. Now, a DNA match is someone who shares DNA with the person who tested, and therefore logically also shares an ancestor or an ancestral couple with the other person who tested. Now, the particular match that I'm going to be looking at today and going through was through Ancestry.com. But most of the steps that I took to find my new quote unquote new ancestors can be duplicated through other services. If you've tested through 23andMe or through MyHeritage or Family Tree DNA or Living DNA, any of those other companies out there, you can use kind of the same steps to grow your family. Now on Ancestry, the users are identified either by using their actual name, by using their initials, or by using a username. And that decision is made by the tester. And in this particular case, Mrs. Scher is the name of the match. She's clearly not using her real name. This is some sort of username. And that might make identifying her and using her DNA results a little bit trickier, but she's there, and so we're going to work with it. We can also see how much DNA is shared between the two testers, as well as a predicted relationship range. In this case, Mrs. Scher and the test share 58 centimorgans of DNA, which is approximately fourth cousins, give or take. So what that means is they probably share a common ancestor about 5 generations back. And then we can also see that Mrs. Scher has created a family tree, and it has 88 people in it. Now, this isn't necessarily 88 ancestors. This is 88 people. This could include her children, her grandchildren, her husband's family, other in-laws, nieces and nephews. We really don't know, but at least she does have a family tree that we are able to take a look at and see if we can kind of curate her tree for clues to how we might be related and grow our own trees. So the first thing that we need to do is try to determine where the match belongs in our own family. When we click through to Mrs. Scher's family tree, we get a little bit of a view here of her ancestors. And unfortunately, most of those 88 people that she has in her tree are not ancestors. Actually, 8 of them are. So we know that our common ancestor is probably 5 generations back. And obviously, this tree doesn't go 5 generations in any direction. Odds are our common ancestor is not here, and we could potentially be related to her through any of these branches. And we could be related to her through any number of ancestors that are not being shown to us here. So her tree, unfortunately, is not going to be a lot of help to us on the outset. So we're going to have to do a little bit of digging since we don't recognize any of these names, and it's not readily apparent to us how we might be related to her. So I went back to the match page between Mrs. Scher and the DNA test that I'm managing. The green boxes here are blocking out some personal information just because a lot of these people are still living. And one of the first things I wanted to point out to you, I've circled in red here, the name of the person who took the test. This isn't my DNA. This is actually the DNA of my grandma's first cousin. And I think a lot of people are probably listening to this and saying, are you kidding? Why on earth would you test somebody so distantly related to you? Well, when you think about it, Dolores really isn't that distantly related to me. Her dad and my great grandma were brother and sister. So Literally half of her ancestors are also my ancestors. Half of her family is related to me. So her DNA is actually very, very useful potentially to me when I'm trying to grow my family tree and learn more about my family history. Just because Dolores isn't my ancestor doesn't mean her DNA can't answer questions. And in this case, she was the secret sauce. She was the missing link. She was the one who was able to, who had the right DNA that I was able to use to figure out who my ancestors were. So from this page, what we really want to look at is the shared matches. When we click on that menu of the tree, ethnicity, and shared matches, we get a list here of people who share DNA with Mrs. Scher and Dolores. And what we're really hoping to see is some people we recognize. Now, in order to determine that we recognize them, you have to do regular old genealogy. I had to spend quite a bit of time growing my family tree, researching my distant cousins by using the census, obituaries, other traditional genealogy sources to grow my family tree. So I know who these people are, which is really fortunate. Beatrice and Sarah, shown here, are mother and daughter. I know exactly how they fit into my tree. And a little bit farther down the list here, this Gary 493 and JL are also another family group. JL is a first cousin to Gary's father. And another thing I wanted to point out about how these match lists are arranged, the closer relatives are closer to the top. So Beatrice, she shares more DNA with Dolores than JL does. So she is a closer relative. She's probably about a second cousin, while JL is probably about a fourth cousin. So we go back into Dolores's family tree, and we can see, since I have already figured out who Beatrice and Sarah are, I know that they're descended from this couple that I've circled here, Peter and Marie. And we also know that based on the amount of DNA that Mrs. Scher and Dolores share, that her common ancestor should be about 5 generations back. So since Mrs. Scher matches Beatrice and Sarah and Dolores, who are both descendants of Peter and Marie, we can kind of take a pretty good guess that Mrs. Scher's ancestors are a couple generations back out past them. So she is probably descended from the parents of either Thor, Kari, Ole, or Ingeborg. And you might be thinking, well, gosh, has that really narrowed it down all that much? It really has. When you think about how many ancestors Dolores has, 4 generations back, we've really narrowed it down. I haven't shown her mother's side of the family on the bottom here, but she has 16 ancestors in that last column, and we've narrowed it down to only 4. We know that we're looking for somebody just in that quarter of her ancestors. So we really have started to narrow it down. And then because I know who Gary and JL are, I know that they're descended from Ole and Ingeborg. So now we can eliminate Thor and Kari's family and just be concentrating on the parents of Ole and Ingeborg. Odds are Mrs. Scher is probably descended from either the parents of Ole or Ingeborg. She's probably related to one of those two. So I know who Ole and Ingeborg are. They were born in the 1790s. They were born in Nes, Hedmark, Norway. And so their parents probably were about 25 years older than they are, give or take. And they also probably lived in Nes. Our ancestors were not nearly as mobile as we are. So they didn't move around much. If their children were born and raised in that community, odds are they were born and raised there as well. Now, it's important to remember that there is no guarantee that Mrs. Scher is related to one of these two people. It is entirely possible that she is a genetic match to their descendants purely by coincidence. It could just be a straight up coincidence. But that's pretty unlikely. That's 5 different descendants of this couple she shares DNA with. she probably is related to one of them. Even though it isn't a guarantee, it's a very logical place to start. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start looking at this couple and trying to figure out how we can connect Mrs. Scher to this couple. So the next step is to try to figure out where in Mrs. Scher's known family we think we might belong. So we have a hypothesis. We think that Mrs. Scher is probably descended from a couple who lived in Nes, Hedmark, Norway, and was of childbearing age during the 1790s. So we go back to her family tree and see if she knows of any ancestors of hers that were living in that area at that time. And it kind of looks like her mother's family could be Norwegian. Looking at those names, Maren Evertsen, that sounds Norwegian. Gjertina Jakobsdottir, that sounds Norwegian. Johannes, we're looking at names that sound like they are probably Norwegian. So this does look promising. And then when we click on Johannes, her great-grandfather, we see that he was indeed born in Hedmark. So that's kind of coinciding with what we were hoping to find. We were hypothesizing that she's descended from a couple who lived there, and she claims to have a great-grandfather who was born there. But when we're looking at her family tree, we can see that it only goes back to the 1830s, and she's really only traced one branch back. It's entirely possible that she has Norwegian ancestry on her father's side of the family and just isn't indicating it here in this tree. Maybe her grandmother, Maren, maybe her family is also from that same part of Norway. So we really haven't narrowed down too much which part of her family we think we should investigate. So the next thing I did, I actually reached out to Mrs. Scher through Ancestry and through most of the services that offer DNA testing. Generally, you are able to contact your DNA matches and ask them questions. So I did that. I sent her an email through the Ancestry Connection service explaining to her what I'd kind of figured out, that I suspect that we're connected through ancestors from Nas Hedmark. Do you know anything? Because just because she's not showing it here doesn't mean she doesn't know. She maybe has a family tree at home in a book. Maybe she keeps her family tree on a different website. Maybe she has a really nice one built out at Family Search, or maybe she just keeps it on her computer in some software. So just because she's not showing it to us doesn't mean she doesn't have a lot of great information. Or maybe she has a cousin who has a lot of great information and would be willing to put me in touch with somebody else who might have the answers. And I was really fortunate. Mrs. Scher actually replied to my message that I sent her. This is not common. Oftentimes your DNA matches will just ignore a message because they aren't interested, don't have time, whatever. They don't always respond. And in this case, I was really fortunate to get a note back from her. And she said, well, I know my grandmother was from Stavanger, and I know my grandfather was from Oslo, but that's really all I know. So just to show you a little bit about the geography of Norway, when we think about where Stavanger is and where Oslo is, they're on kind of opposite sides of the country. Oslo's a lot closer to Nes. So I think we're probably going to start chasing down her grandfather's family because it's geographically much closer to Nes than Stavanger is. But life isn't fair. I was hoping that Mrs. Scher would know the answer and tell me, but she said, that's all I know. And what that usually means is that's all she knows. If she had more information, she probably would have shared it. Genealogists are usually excited to exchange information and help each other. And if somebody says they don't know, it means they don't know. And I was on my own. So what I did is I started doing traditional, old-fashioned, as I call it, genealogy, going through census records, church records, trying to track down her ancestors through her grandfather's family because I suspected that that was the more promising lead based on the clues that I already had. So I was able to go back several generations, and I found a couple who was born in the 1790s. Her ancestors, Jens Anderson and his wife, Anna Jonsdottir. They were both born in the 1790s. They were living in Nes. this is where we wanted to get. We wanted to find some people who were contemporary to Ole and Ingeborg, and we found a couple who was. So now it's time to see if we can try to connect these two couples. We want to put it all together. We have two couples who were born at about the same time, in the same place. It's reasonable to think that we could be looking at some siblings here. Now, one thing to remember, Norwegians in the 17 and 1800s used a patronymic naming system. So we know the first name of the fathers of these four individuals. And two of them have a father with the same first name. Now, just because two men have the same first name certainly doesn't mean they are the same person. But it's something worth investigating. Ole and Jens both have a father named Anders. They were both born in the 1790s in the same place. Maybe they're brothers. Maybe they're not, but maybe they are. And one of the nice things about this particular time frame, a really nice census was taken in Norway in 1801. So I decided that I would look in the 1801 census in Ness and look for a family that had a father named Anders with two little boys named Jens and Ole. And there was exactly one family in Ness in 1801 who had a husband named Anders, his wife, and three sons, and the two youngest sons were indeed named Jens and Ole. And at this point in time, I had no idea who the parents of my Ole Anderson were. His marriage record to Ingeborg did not indicate a name for his parents. It only gave an age. So I knew he was born in the late 1790s, but I didn't really know exactly when. Norway didn't do a really good census again until 1865, and he'd already died. So he wasn't living on the 1865 census, and there was more than one Ole Anderson who died in Ness between the date of his marriage and 1865. I didn't know which death record might be his. I went to the Ness Bygdebok, and there is no entry in there for an Ole Anderson who married an Ingeborg Larsdottir, so that was a dead end for me. Based on his marriage record, I knew his approximate age, but when I went to the 1801 census just looking for a little boy named Ole Anderson in Ness, there are 5 of them. So I had absolutely no way of knowing which family was the correct family. I didn't know which of those 5 boys was my Ole Anderson. The only way that I was able to be certain, or to help make me certain, that I was looking at the right family was when a descendant of Ole's brother Jens took a DNA test, and I was able to connect those 2 families with DNA. Their names are right, their ages are right, they're living in the same place, they have a genetic link. I'm feeling pretty confident that I've found, finally, the right family. Now, there is one other clue that has sealed the deal for me. Obviously, it's possible that these 2 men could share DNA because maybe they're related in a different way. Maybe I haven't found the right family. Maybe they're actually cousins. Maybe they weren't brothers at all. Maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree. But there is another tradition that provided a nice clue for me. Norwegians at this time generally named their firstborn daughters after their mothers. So men would usually name their oldest daughter after their mother, and then the secondborn daughter would be named after their mother-in-law. Well, their mother's name is Viveka. It's a very, very unusual name in Norway. You don't see that very often. And both Jens and Ole named their firstborn daughter Viveka. So there's a pretty good chance that's their mother's name. There is only one family in Ness who has a father named Anders, a wife named Viveka, and 2 boys named Jens and Ole. I'm feeling pretty confident. We have found the right family. I finally know which of those 5 Ole Andersons is my Ole Anderson. And this is a pretty common problem among people doing Norwegian genealogy. There are so many people with the exact same name who are about the same age, living in the same place. They didn't use a wide variety of names. We run into this all the time. It's really, really, really hard sometimes to distinguish between who is your ancestor and who's just a neighbor. And this is one of the reasons that I advocate for Norwegians to try a DNA test. It will help you potentially draw the lines between two people who have the same name. It was the only way that I could have done it. The paper trail did not make it clear. The DNA evidence did. So if you've taken a DNA test and need some help getting a little bit more out of your results, I'm happy to sit down with you either in person if you happen to be in the Madison area. I'd be happy to do that. Otherwise, we could do it online, do it virtually, and see if we can come up with some ways that you can use it to help grow your family tree. And of course, if you have other questions for us, our email address and phone number are right here on this slide. And you can always visit our website. We've got some other webinars up there that address other topics that maybe would be of interest to you. So thank you very much for joining me today.